What's up everyone, it's Shaf coming at you with a video topic that's been asked of me to discuss for so long. And it's something that really gets memed on in the mill community at large, and just something that, the modern community doesn't really know about. It's what can Red provide to the most secretive guild on Ravnica, and what can Grixis do to morph modern mill? Before we get into the topic in general, I should point out that this is really going to be a talking head video, so there are going to be some visuals on screen, but if you want to leave this on in the background like a podcast and maybe play some arena or whatever, then go ahead. It's about the discussion. And before we head into Grixis specifically, we need to take a step back and understand mill from a grassroots perspective. Take it from the bottom up. What is mill good at? Well, mill is recently taking its seat amongst its tier 1 peers in modern, and thanks to the printing of Ruin Crab, its parallel to Hedron Crab, it finally got the consistency it needs to compete. But what is it good at? What does it beat up on? Why hasn't it been around before? Well, really, the answer to that question is just Ruin Crab. It's provided that consistency to the best mill spell in the deck. But what it beats up on, well, first and foremost, the fragile combo decks and the big mana decks fall really hard to a card that doesn't really get to see a lot of play, but has that niche kind of aspect in sideboards. I'm talking about surgical extraction, specifically against decks like Tron per se. If you mill over a Tron land and you surgical that bad boy out of there, that deck falls apart. It has no clock against your mill supremacy. And then we're talking about the control strategies. Let's look at the Uro piles. If you resolve a Mesmeric Orb, you're more than happy to mill over an Uro, because guess what? A bad control player will tap out, further feeding into the Mesmeric Orb to cast the Uro. They'll tap out to counter your spells with a Mesmeric Orb on the battlefield. Little do they know that you're chipping away at them piece by piece. And then finally, we're really looking at the graveyard strategies. Have you ever read Crypt Incursion? I've heard many people tell me that, well, look at my dredge deck. It's like the mill deck is helping me. Oh, but wait. In response to that dredge, I'm about to gain 3 life for literally every card in your graveyard. Mill has a great spot in the modern meta, just beyond all my ranting. But there are downfalls. And that's the key here. First and foremost, the modern mill archetype can be classified as a mid-range strategy. In a lot of ways, it plays a tempo game and then tries to enact its plan when the coast is clear. The problem is that it has a real difficult time against the mid-range mirror. I'm talking about the deck list of Jund and, well, Death Shadow of almost any variant. Death Shadow having such a great efficiency in terms of mana with threat and interaction. It's just so low, having 1 CMC threats that just hit you for 1 billion and then 1 CMC counter spells. It's hard to interact on that aspect in terms of tempo with mana. And then you have decks like Jund that have such a plethora of threats. It's hard to really have an answer for everything at the same time. After killing a creature, they end up paying a land that's just going to hit you in the face for more and more every turn. But more so, it's the aggro strategies. Now, the creature-based aggro strategies, although not favored, we do have, again, Crypt Incursion. There's a lot of removal, and then there's just a lot of other cards that slowly come together to help shore up those matchups in the post-board scenario. But specifically, the red-based aggro strategies are probably the biggest difficulty for mill in general. Now, other than the Blue Moon memes of Emrakul's in the main board, Burn is the toughest matchup in the tier 1 sense for modern mill. The consistency in what it does for its mana, dealing 3 damage, it's working with a 20 card library, whereas we're working with a 53 card library. We're kind of parallels in that sense, and we just can't match up on rate. So the deck will burn us out a lot faster than we can burn them out. More recently, we have deck lists such as Mono Red Prowess seeing a rise, especially when the meta shifted underneath our feet in the Hogak era. We see that that deck is extremely explosive, low to the ground, and if you don't have early removal, you're not really going to be able to get a hold of them anytime soon. So these are really where Dimir Mill specifically suffers. And that's where, when times get tough or the opportunity presents itself, the mill community at large sought to add a color to try and shore some of these up. Specifically, for a very long time, the color of choice was Esper. It was white. And with that shard, we looked at really 4 main payoffs. We looked at Path to Exile, Rest in Peace, Timely Reinforcements, and the icing on the cake, Leyline of Sanctity. Now, Stony Silence was there for a little bit of time, but we can ignore that due to multiple other factors, but mainly the banning of, well, Mox Opal, just shutting the efficiency of that card down. So we're looking at these 4. And in just a lot of ways, with more recent inclusions such as Kaya, Orzhov Usurper, and Teferi Time Raveler, just these kind of mid-range payoffs, the deck was really good at being very removal-centric and 1-for-1. So if you had creature-heavy metas and decks that wanted to play a little bit of a slower game with their creatures, hey, even the Taxes decks, Esper Mill was fantastic. There was just so many things that the deck could do. Timely Reinforcements was just a great way to gain life and provide some blockers. And then you have Kaya and maybe Teferi to provide that grindy plan, especially against the control decks. I mean, look at Leyline of Sanctity, single-handedly shoring up the burn matchup, because now those lava spikes can't hit you in the face. The problem is that you could play it in Dimir, the problem is you couldn't cast it. But Esper provided that solution in case the burn player found their wear and tear. So it was great. Esper was doing a lot. The problem was that obviously the mana base was relatively painful. The cards that were played in Esper, you couldn't really splash for. It was very primary-esque plan. You need to get a lot of white sources out. That's a lot of shocks. And then especially against the mid-range matchups such as Death Shadow and Jund, we still had the problem of white doesn't really have a catch-all answer to these multiple permanent types that they can get out there, and Death Shadow still had very efficient counter spells. So again, it's tough to have answers to everything when you're playing Esper. In comes Assassin's Trophy, providing Sultai Mill for the first time with the Breath of Fresh Air, splashing green for a card that is able to answer any permanent that your opponent controls, heck, even bounce lands and Tron lands. With the price of letting them search for a basic, fantastic, enabling your archive traps without them knowing. Now, the deck didn't really get its legs until Theros Beyond Death, because it didn't have the payoff suite. It didn't have the wide range of things that you could do with it, like the Leyline of Sanctities and stuff like that. It really just had the Path to Exile, but Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, is what gave Sultai Mill its legs. Card draw, life gain, landfall triggers out the wazoo for your crabs. What more could you want? Especially with Mesmeric Orb being able to tap out and feed into the escape cost of the Uros. It really was a match made in heaven. But the problem with Sultai was that, well, when Uro wasn't there, the deck really fell apart. And that's what it came down to. You relied so heavily on Uro to block your Gurmag Anglers, to undo the Thoughtseizes, to block the Goblin Guides and undo the Lava Spikes. It was the central part of the plan. That was it. The games where you did not find Uro, you did not mill it over with some Hedron Crabs triggers pointed at yourself. Those were the tough games. And so that's ultimately, again, past the Arkham's Astrolabe banning helping smooth out the mana. That's where that deck had its shortcomings. And of course, we had other payoffs like Weather the Storm and Veil of Summer. Weather the Storm being fantastic still to this day against the prowess strategies when they kind of try and go off, and Veil of Summer being a fantastic alternative to the blue counter magic against the control strategies. It's pretty nice that way. But again, the matchups where you don't find Uro become very tough. So now you have this give and take. You have this choice between Esper Mill having a very difficult matchup, still against the mid-range strategies, but great against the aggro strategies. And then you have the Uro matchup where if you don't find Uro, you're kind of crap out of luck. Let me be honest. So in all of this, where does Grixis Mill fit in? Well, I should use this background to get everyone to understand that the reason we took so long to get here is I needed to hammer in the point that you should only be adding a color to Dimir Mill to solve a problem, to fill a gap. And, well, Mill prides itself in being able to manage the Maelstrom, to tackle the decks that like to take the long way around, as those are the most exploitable. It's the decks that like to take the brute force approach, throwing 50 lightning bolt variants at you, that tend to prove the problem. So, in that in mind, how can Grixis, how can Red help shore that up? What can it patch? It's not evidently clear, but I think some cards should help kind of understand where I'm trying to go with this. So I went on MTG Goldfish and I looked up just the most played red cards in the meta, and I filtered some stuff out. We're not concerned with Boil for very obvious reasons, or stuff like Monastery Swiftspear. It doesn't really match what we're trying to do because we can't really cast enough spells to, at once to make it very large. So the cards that I want to talk about to start my basis here is, in no particular order, Lightning Bolt, Kroxa, Kolaghan's Command, Cleansing Wildfire, and heck, Blood Moon. So go with the easy ones first. Cleansing Wildfire and Blood Moon, used to tackle the greedy mana bases and the big mana strategies. What did I say in the beginning though? Those are strategies that were already favored against. The greedy mana bases are primarily in the Uro decks, which are the control decks, which we're perfectly fine with. And the Tron decks and the Amulet decks. We don't really need Blood Moon for those. We got Surgical Extractions to take out the prime times. What's the point in disrupting lands when we've literally neutered their whole strategy? They can play all the lands they damn want. So those cards are kind of kaput. We don't care. But this is where we start kind of getting into the little bit of a juice here. These cards are rather interesting. First and foremost, Kroxa. Acting as a parallel to Uro Titan of Nature's Wrath, instead of drawing cards and gaining life, it tries to, instead of uplift our plan, it tries to devalue our opponent's plan by making them discard and lose life. Now, the discarding cards can be useful, especially against the mid-range strategies that like to hold up different forms of answers, multiple cards. It's great forcing them to get that out, and again, Mesmeric Orb allowing us to very easily pay the escape cost to get it back. Fantastic blocker, very aggressive threat. The problem is that life aspect, that losing life aspect, that is adding another axis to which Mill doesn't really want to interact with. Mill primarily interacts with the battlefield they hand, and unfortunately the most random aspect of an opponent's game plan, their library. So adding that fourth element can be tricky, but again, Kroxa has its merits, especially when you consider Kroxa versus Uro. There's a lot of Luros Dimir builds out there going around the 5-0 list, and Luros and Kroxa go pretty damn well together. It's one of the very first interactions that people talked about when the companions were spoiled. So that's a plus in Kroxa's favor. What about Kolaghan's Command? Well, Kolaghan's Command has really been one of the pillars of the modern format for a very long time, and it still sees a lot of play, of course, in the Jund decks and the Mardu Pyromancer decks whenever they show up. It's a great card. The artifact side of things we can relatively ignore, except for maybe against the Tron decks. Not a lot of pesky artifacts that we have to deal with. Specifically, I'm looking at the ability to recur cards like Kroxa and Hedron Crab, and then the ability to remove some smaller creatures off the board, some early game threats, as well as instant speed discard, which again can be nice of forcing your opponent to interact on a step that they may not want to, like their upkeep before they get to draw and get the most information, kind of things like that. There's a lot of ways that that card can work at 3 mana, but again, 3 mana is a very competitive slot for Mill. At 3 mana, you could be casting Crypt Incursion. At 3 mana, you could be Field of Ruining into an Archive Trap. At 3 mana, you could be casting Fraying Sanity. So Kolaghan's Command better be doing a lot, and the modal nature of it kind of tries to make up for that. Finally, Lightning Bolt. The Fatal Push, Path to Exile, and in many ways Assassin's Trophy parallel. And Lightning Bolt has a lot of pluses to it in compared to the other cards. Path to Exile and Assassin's Trophy allow your opponents to grab basics when they know you don't have Archive Traps, and so it has that downside there. Ramps your opponent. Lightning Bolt kind of like Assassin's Trophy, interacts with Planeswalkers. You're able to destroy a Narset when it down ticks. That's nice, and you're able to deal with some early threats as well. The problem is you're not able to deal with some early threats, such as Uro, where Fatal Push would be able to handle an Uro if you had a permanent leave like a fetch. Not even Primeval Titan, a genuine pillar of the format. You need multiple lightning bolts for that. And finally, again, just like Kroxa, it deals direct damage to our opponent, a fourth axis that Mill doesn't interact on. But it kind of feels like there's a pattern evolving here. That fourth axis, the life loss. Now, we're not really looking at the artifact side of Red. Red is very good at dealing with artifacts, and more recently it's getting better at drawing cards, but we're a blue deck. We don't care how Red draws cards. We can do it better. We're not looking at Shatterstorm either to save the day. So can we, Mill, use the Grixis aspect of things to leverage a life loss angle? Let's look at things here. Lightning Bolt losing life, Kroxa being a recurable threat. There feels like a lot of ways that these are kind of enablers to some payoffs. Because these aren't necessarily payoffs, I would argue. Here's my 3 proposals for stepping stones into thinking about Grixis Mill. Jace's Phantasm, Nicol Bolas, specifically Nicol Bolas the Ravager, but we can go into some other ones as well. And then finally, Blood Chief Ascension. Now, I know a lot of you want that third card here. Let's go one step at a time. Let's start with Nicol Bolas. So, Nicol Bolas I like the least here, but it's a very promising card because really when we see Grixis control in Modern and right now in Standard Grixis midrange, it's Nicol Bolas, or in Historic I should say, sorry. It's Nicol Bolas, that's the payoff. It slams down, deals with Planeswalkers, kills creatures, reanimates stuff, it draws cards. There's a lot of things that Nicol Bolas does, even enters as a body and forces discard. So again, acting on that discard angle, devaluing your opponent's plan while also providing a formidable blocker in the creature Nicol Bolas of 4/4. It's kind of nice in that aspect. And then you flip it and draws cards, again, reanimates. It does a lot of things. So could there be a Grixis shell that goes into the discard side of things, plays Ensnaring Bridge, still plays the mill package, but maybe not as proactively? Do we start shaving Ruin Crabs and Hedron Crabs, play a slower plan, and go really into Grixis mill control? That's one way to think about it. What about Jace's Phantasm? With Jace's Phantasm, I actually really want to accentuate the concept of going face and dealing damage. The thing is, against the burn strategies and against the mid-range strategies where the mill plan might just not work, you're not able to keep on pace with the damage that they're doing and the disruption that they are enacting on you, Jace's Phantasm, Lightning Bolt, Kroxa, heck even Snapcaster Mage for those bolt snap bolt lines are going to be a fantastic way to attack your opponent's life total. Hitting him in the face, pair it with Luros. You got a lot of recursion, maybe throw some unearths in there. There's going to be a lot of ways to really just slam your opponents in the face if the mill plan is not working. Right? Not a bad way. Again, we're accentuating the life loss aspect of it, not the control aspect, the life loss aspect of it. Finally, speaking of life loss, Blood Chief Ascension, an enchantment that's been on the fringe of Modern playability for the longest time. It seems that brewers haven't been able to break through with the card. They haven't found the right formula. And here I propose that Grixis Mill could be that formula. First and foremost, it's 1 mana. Not bad. Second, it's not red, it's black. It's on the primary plan of what Dimir Mill is. It's castable. It's 1 CMC. Not bad. And enchantment. Very difficult permanent type to deal with. Right? Especially against the opposing red decks. It's not a permanent type that Prowess can deal with. But what does it pay off for? Well, with the lightning bolts combined with fetch lands that your opponent's going to be cracking, and canopy lands that they're going to be tapping to lose life, and Croxes that you're going to be throwing at their face, it's going to be really easy to get some counters onto this enchantment. And once you do, your mill plan becomes an alternate win condition, working with the mill plan to not only, like the other, unlike I should say, the other two plans that I mentioned, gaining you life while also dealing damage. So if you find your opponent at a high life total, doesn't matter because you're going to be sustaining yourself. While you mill over their deck and you just kind of wait it through, you're going to be able to gain life, sustain yourself with a card like Bloodchief's Ascension. So, could there be a mid-range type of deck, maybe with Scheming Symmetry, to search up Bloodchief's Thirst? As much as I hate Scheming Symmetry, I gotta mention it here because there has to be a way that works with the mill to enable the mill plan, Scheming Symmetry turning on Archive traps, but also find the Bloodchief's Thirst when you need it. If you find that you Scheming Symmetry and Archive trap them and you're seeing a bunch of Monster Swift Spears, well, you're going to be happy that you tutored up that Bloodchief's Thirst, or you might have it in your opening hand. It's going to be a great way to start that plan rolling. So that's my proposal. I'm going to leave it up to the brewers and the saboteurs. Can Grixis Mill work? Well, hopefully that noise that just came out of my PC, hopefully that wasn't a problem. Because I don't think Grixis Mill, especially with these, well, suggestions, should prove too much of a problem for y'all to brew up. I know I'm going to be doing some brewing myself. And of course, if you wanted to kind of get those brews early, you wanted to get this content early, or just kind of rack my brain for everything, the Patreon is where you want to join. Link down below. The place where you can get my content early, keep the quality high and the lights on. As you see, I'm kind of stuttering here. And I can't even think. The video's been a long one, and as you've noticed, we've one-taked it. So, thank you, patrons. Again, link down below if you want to support that. But we're gonna leave it there. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I've missed any Grixis payoffs. Let me know if I maybe misspoke on a card. Maybe I'm not really highlighting something about a card, and I was missing one of the more powerful aspects of maybe Kolaghan's Command that I didn't mention. Let me know in the comment section down below. But other than that, remember that even the impossible is possible, and as we ponder that thought, I hope you'll join me next time as we take a glimpse into the unthinkable.